The cantina doors groaned open as Takakota Yazi stepped inside, his wide shoulders nearly brushing the frame. The man was a mountain in worn boots, dust clinging to his dark coat like a second skin. Beneath the brim of a battered brown Stetson, his sharp cheekbones and calm, unreadable eyes scanned the room. He looked like he hadn't spoken in days and liked it that way. He crossed the floor without a word, his long gait slow from the miles behind him. Paso Blanco was just another town carved into the brittle land of West Texas, where the sun baked everything dry and the wind whispered like old regrets. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved toward the darkest corner, where the shadows were thick enough to forget things. "Water," he said, voice low like the growl of something half asleep and dangerous. The barkeep, short, red-faced, and balding, handed him a tin cup without meeting his eyes. Takakota sipped. The water tasted of iron and suspicion. He said nothing. A man approached his table, mid-40s, clean-shaven, not a speck of dust on his polished boots or pressed wool coat. Something about him felt wrong. Maybe it was his hands soft, too clean for someone this far west, or maybe it was the smile, too smooth, too practiced. "Mind if I join you, friend?" the man asked, already pulling out the chair. Takakota didn't stop him. The stranger took that as permission and sat down across from him, setting down a leather glove on the table like it mattered. "A man like you looks like he's seen the trail." "Let me buy you a warm meal," the stranger said. "Hospitality, you understand." Takakota studied the man's face the way a hunter reads tracks in dry earth. "Why?" The stranger chuckled. "Because a man shouldn't eat alone after a long ride. And because there's plenty to go around." The barkeep brought over a bowl of steaming corn stew, thick with meat and spiced with cumin and chili. The scent twisted in Takakota's gut. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers wrapped around the wooden spoon, and he brought it halfway to his mouth. That's when it came. "Don't eat it. The man put something in your food." The voice burst out from nowhere, sharp, high, and terrified. "A little girl." Everyone in the room froze. Takakota lowered the spoon slowly and turned his head. From behind the wooden counter, between the slats near the floor, a pair of wide brown eyes stared up at him. A girl, maybe 8 years old, thin, dirt-streaked face, torn blue dress clinging to her like it hadn't been washed in months, and those eyes too old for her years, full of fear and defiance. "She's lying," the stranger snapped. His smile vanished like fog under sun. "Probably touched in the head. That one's always causing trouble." Takakota set the spoon down. The girl crawled out from under the counter, holding a patchwork rag doll clutched tight to her chest. Her bare feet were filthy, one heel bleeding. She pointed a trembling finger at the stew. "I saw him put powder in it, I swear. White stuff. He thought nobody saw." Takakota looked at the stranger. The man's hand slid toward his coat. Without a word, Takakota stood, took the bowl, and tipped it out onto the table. Thick stew spilled, and there swirled into the gravy was a shimmer of white that didn't belong. "Well," Takakota said, voice quiet, "ain't hungry anymore." The stranger's hand went for the inside of his coat, but Takakota moved first. He reached across the table and slammed the man's wrist into the wood with a sound like breaking branches. The stranger yelped, half stood, and drew a pistol with his other hand. Takakota flipped the table. The room exploded. Chairs scraped back, men ducked, and someone screamed. Takakota grabbed the girl and hauled her behind him as the shot rang out, a bullet splitting the air where his head had been a second ago. Another shout, "Get out of the way!" And then the barkeep went for his shotgun under the bar. Takakota didn't wait. He crashed through the back door, shoving it open with one massive shoulder, pulling the girl with him as they burst into the alley behind the cantina. The late afternoon light struck hard against the stone walls. Dust rose up in little clouds with each step. They ran. He didn't speak until they were 2 blocks down, breath steaming in the cool air. The girl kept up despite her size, her doll clutched in one arm, the other holding his hand like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. "You got a name?" he asked, finally stopping behind an old blacksmith's shed. "Rosa," she said, panting. "Rosa Herrera. You always hide under counters and yell at strangers." "Only when they're about to die," she shot back. Takakota almost smiled. Almost. But there was shouting now. Behind them, back at the cantina. Men pouring into the street. Names being shouted. Someone said Apache. Someone else said Bounty. His stomach turned. So that was it. "They're hunting you, huh?" Rosa asked, reading his face. "Looks like." "They're gonna kill me too," she said quietly. "For helping you." He looked down at her. This scrap of a girl. She had bruises under the dirt, a split lip, and cuts on her wrists that hadn't healed right. But she hadn't hesitated to speak up, hadn't run when things went bad. She reminded him of someone, a niece, long dead, fever, winter, another life. "Come on," he said. "We gotta move." They slipped into the stables behind the general store. No one saw them. Takakota grabbed an old canvas pack, filled it with whatever supplies he could scrounge: dried beans, rope, matches. Rosa didn't speak, just followed. An hour later they crossed the last fence outside Paso Blanco. The wind caught the edge of Rosa's ragged dress. The sky was streaked orange and gold, long clouds stretching like scars across it. Takakota's boots kicked up dust as they moved down the trail that led into the brush. "You really don't have nobody?" he asked. Rosa shook her head. "The cantina man said I owed him food and shelter, but he lied. He locked me in the back, used me to clean and fetch bottles. I saw what he did to the others. I knew I had to run. But then I saw you come in. Why warn me?" She didn't answer right away. Then she looked up at him with eyes steady and too grown. "Because you looked tired. Not dangerous. Just lost." They walked in silence as the sun dipped lower. Somewhere behind them, Paso Blanco was still shouting, still hunting. Ahead, only quiet, and dust, and sky. But something had shifted. A beginning, maybe. As they reached the first rise of land and crested it, Rosa turned to glance back. Takakota didn't. She asked, "Where are we going?" He looked to the horizon, where the land turned from flat to something wilder. "Somewhere they won't find us tonight. And tomorrow?" He paused. "Tomorrow. We figure it out." They moved on. But neither of them saw the man who watched from the edge of town with binoculars in hand and a wanted poster in his coat. The poster had Takakota's face on it, but someone had written a new number over the old bounty, and now it was high enough to make anyone greedy, even men who didn't usually chase ghosts. The stars were beginning to shimmer above the mesquite trees by the time Takakota and Rosa stopped moving. The light was almost gone. The last streaks of gold burned down to ash along the western horizon, the kind of night where the wind whispered low and the land felt ancient. Takakota crouched beneath a crooked-limbed cedar and started building a fire with dry bark and flint. Rosa sat nearby, her knees hugged to her chest, still holding her tattered doll. Her bare feet were cracked and blistered. She hadn't said a word since they left Paso Blanco behind, but her eyes hadn't stopped watching him. "You ever built a fire before?" Takakota asked without looking up. She shook her head. "Come here," he said. "You might need to one day." He showed her where to place the kindling, how to cradle the flame with patience, not force. When the sparks caught and the tiny fire licked upward into orange breath, Rosa smiled for the first time. It's like magic, she whispered. It's survival, he replied. But sometimes they're the same thing. They sat together, the fire crackling low between them, casting shadows on their faces. The silence was companionable now, not heavy, not yet. After a while, Rosa spoke. Was it true, what that man said? That there's money for Apache scalps? Takakota stared into the fire. The wood popped and hissed. Yeah, he said finally. Some folks think we're more useful dead than alive. Rosa nodded slowly, like she'd already guessed. The man at the cantina, he talked like that too. Said nobody would miss someone like you. And what about you? Takakota asked, glancing over. She looked down at her feet. Nobody's missed me in a long time. He let that hang in the air a moment, then reached into his shirt and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside were herbs, dried and crumbling, wrapped in soft buckskin. He picked a few brittle leaves and handed them to her. Chew these. They help take the edge off the hunger. She didn't hesitate. The taste made her wince, but she kept chewing. Who taught you about that stuff? She asked, mouth full of bitterness. My grandmother, he said. She raised me after my parents died. She could name every plant in the desert. Said the land could heal if you knew how to listen. Is she still alive? No, he answered softly. Passed 2 winters ago. Rosa was quiet for a beat. Then, almost too softly to hear, she said, The man at the cantina said my parents died of fever. But I don't think that's true. Takakota turned toward her. I remember fire, screaming, something bad, and then I was just there, in the back room. He never let me leave. Said I owed him for the food, but I cleaned bottles and floors. He made me beg for scraps. Takakota clenched his jaw, the firelight catching the angle of his cheekbone like a blade. You ain't going back there, he said. I know, she whispered. I wouldn't survive it a second time. They fell into silence again. The fire crackled and a coyote called in the distance. Hours passed. Rosa curled up near the flames, finally drifting to sleep with her doll pressed to her chest. Takakota kept watch, eyes scanning the dark, every sense tuned to the wild. He was about to add more wood to the fire when he heard it. A twig snapped behind them, then another. He didn't move, just listened. 2 sets of feet, approaching slow, careful. He put a hand on Rosa's shoulder and squeezed gently. She blinked awake, confused. He put a finger to his lips. Without a sound, he grabbed his knife from the ground beside him and shifted his weight to one knee. Voices, low, male, coming closer, coming. That fire's fresh. You sure it's him? Saw the boots. Big bastard. Gotta be the Apache. Takakota moved like wind over stone. He grabbed Rosa, whispered, Run into the trees. Stay low. Go that way. Don't look back. But, go. Now. She slipped into the dark like a shadow. The bounty hunter stepped into the edge of the clearing just as Takakota doused the fire with dirt. He moved too fast for a man his size, grabbing the first one by the coat and slamming him backward into a tree. The second raised a pistol, but Takakota kicked it from his hand and sent him sprawling. The first hunter got a shot off. It grazed Takakota's shoulder. Pain flared white-hot. He roared, shoved the man down, and drove the butt of his knife's handle into his temple. The second one scrambled up and ran. Takakota didn't chase him. He turned instead, blood dripping down his sleeve, and searched the tree line. Rosa, he called low. She emerged a minute later, dirt-smudged and shaking, but unharmed. Are they gone? She asked, eyes wide. For now, he said. She stared at the blood on his shirt. You're hurt. Not bad, but it's bleeding. I've bled before. She hesitated, then walked over and reached for the herb pouch. You showed me how, she said. Now let me do it. He let her tend to the wound in silence, her small fingers working with a kind of seriousness far beyond her age. When she finished, she sat back, breathing hard. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Didn't say you had to. Still, I'm saying it." He looked at her then, really looked. Not a stray, not a burden. Something stronger, something permanent. "You did good," he said. She smiled, tired and proud. They found a new place to camp, further from the trail. Takakota set snares. Rosa gathered firewood. They worked like they'd done it forever. That night, under a sky full of stars and no one chasing them for the moment, they sat close by the flame. "Are we running forever?" Rosa asked. "No," Takakota said. "Just until we find somewhere no one knows our names. And when we do, then we build something different." She nodded slowly. "You're not like anyone I've met. Neither are you." And in that quiet moment, it wasn't just a runaway and an exile sitting by the fire. It was something beginning, a bond, a family, not by blood but by choice. But the hunter who'd escaped wasn't far. He'd followed just close enough to mark their trail, just far enough to avoid another fight. By morning, he'd be in Paso Blanco, and by nightfall there'd be a bounty caravan headed their way. This time with more men and more guns. The land changed as they moved north, shifting from brittle flats to high country. The wind tasted of pine, and the air carried a stillness that only came with altitude. Rosa's feet bled again, but she never once asked to stop. She didn't speak much, not since the night of the ambush. Takakota didn't press her. Some silences weren't meant to be filled. They followed deer trails and dried creek beds, sleeping in the shadow of rock formations, drinking from snowmelt pools. He was leading them toward a place he hadn't seen in years, the canyon where his cousin Nalnish's band had settled after the raids. It wasn't home anymore, not since he'd left during the split, but it was close enough to safety. Close enough, he hoped, to give Rosa a place to rest, maybe even stay. By the third day, they reached the rim of the canyon. Smoke curled from cooking fires far below. He could hear the distant echo of children's laughter, the clatter of tools against stone, and the unmistakable sound of drums, slow, steady, ceremonial. He stood for a long moment, staring down at what used to be his world. "You sure they'll let us in?" Rosa asked quietly, standing beside him. He hesitated. "No," he said. She didn't ask anything else. They descended late in the day, the sun behind them casting long shadows as they entered the outer ring of shelters built into the red rock. A few heads turned, then more. Men paused mid-task. Women drew their children closer. A silence spread like oil over the dust. Takakota recognized faces, some older, some worn by the years, but all familiar. Nalnish stepped forward first, taller now, gray at the temples. His face betrayed nothing but the cautious tension of a man seeing a ghost. "Cousin," Nalnish said in Apache, "you look like hell." "You look like you got soft," Takakota replied. There was a pause, then a chuckle, brief, but real, until Nalnish saw Rosa. She had stepped half a pace behind Takakota, eyes wide. She wore a soft blue dress too thin for the mountain wind. Her hands clutched the same doll, now patched again with new stitching. The moment Nalnish saw her, his face changed. "So that's why you came back." "She saved my life," Takakota said. "She's white. She's a child. She's not ours." Behind them, murmurs grew louder. Elders came from the center of the camp. One of them, a woman named Shawnee, white-haired and sharp-eyed, approached slowly, leaning on a carved cane. "I warned them you'd bring trouble if you ever came back," she said, her voice stronger than her age suggested. "And here you are." With one of theirs, Takakota's voice was even. "She has nowhere else to go." "Then that's her problem, not ours," Shawnee snapped. "Or maybe it's your shame." Rosa stood straighter. She didn't speak, didn't cry, but her chin lifted. Takakota could feel the heat of her body behind him, trying to be brave. "You think I forgot what they did to us," Shani continued. "How many of our sons died for their land? How many women were taken, and now you come walking back into our camp with one of them?" "She's not them," Takakota said. "She never will be one of us." Nalnish stepped between them. "The timing is bad, cousin. Soldiers are pushing deeper into the hills. Any weakness, any doubt could cost us. I can't protect you if you stay." "I didn't ask you to," Takakota said. Shani raised her chin. "She cannot stay here. If you stay, she stays. If she stays, the camp divides. And if the camp divides, we fall. That's what you bring back to us." He turned to Rosa then. She looked up at him, lips pressed tight, her face flushed with humiliation she didn't understand but could feel. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to cry. He knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I promised you something better," he said. "Not this." "You don't have to leave because of me," she whispered. "I can go." "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't walk alone ever again." He stood and looked at Nalnish, then the others. "Family isn't who accepts you when it's easy," he said, loud enough for the circle to hear. "It's who stands by you when it's not." They left without another word. The silence behind them was louder than any farewell. They walked until the canyon narrowed into open hills again, and the stars came out in a sky as wide as forever. They stopped by a creek that ran cold over smooth stones, and Rosa crouched to splash her face with water. "Are you angry at them?" she asked quietly. Takakota didn't answer for a while. "I'm disappointed," he said, "but not surprised." Rosa sat beside him on the riverbank, pulling her knees to her chest. "I don't want to be a problem." "You're not. They made you leave your people." "I already left them," he said. "Today just made it official." She reached for his hand and he didn't pull away. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to prove herself. And for the first time, he let himself believe he could belong somewhere again, even if it wasn't a place. The night settled deep around them. They built a fire from scratch. She started it on the first try. He watched her, the flames dancing in her eyes. For all her scars, she wasn't broken. Not yet. But Takakota knew what was coming. Tomorrow they'd have to keep moving. And tomorrow the bounty on his head would stretch longer shadows. And somewhere, a man named Vasquez was beginning to hear whispers that the Apache he thought was dead wasn't dead after all, and that the girl who saw too much hadn't disappeared like planned. Tomorrow would not be kind. They had been walking along the edge of a dried creek bed when Rosa stumbled. She didn't cry out, didn't say anything at all, just dropped to her knees in the dust and vomited. Takakota was beside her in an instant. Her skin was hot under his hand, too hot. She shivered even as sweat glistened at her hairline, her breath shallow and fast. He lifted her in his arms like she weighed nothing at all, even though her body burned with fever and fear. The sky above was losing color fast, the sun dipping behind the ridge. He needed shelter, somewhere hidden, safe, close to water. He found a shallow cave beneath a limestone overhang where the air stayed cool. There was a spring nearby, clean enough. He laid her down on the bed of moss and stripped off the sweat-soaked dress, replacing it with a blanket from his pack. Her lips murmured words in sleep, but they made no sense. Names, maybe. Prayers. He pressed his palm to her forehead. Too hot. She was burning from the inside out. He worked quickly, driven by instinct and old memory. His grandmother's teachings came back to him in fragments, the bitter bark that cooled the blood, the sage that chased away spirits, the stones that could hold heat and bring it out of the body when placed just right. He crushed dried willow leaves between stones, boiled them in water from the spring. He soaked cloth and laid it across Rosa's head, wrists, ankles. He whispered songs he hadn't sung in years, his voice low and cracked, as if it remembered better days. He didn't sleep. Not the first night, nor the second. On the third, her breathing turned ragged. "Stay with me," he whispered. He dipped a small cloth into the water again and placed it on her chest. Her lips were pale, her skin ashen. The fever had taken hold deep. He knew how it went. It could burn through a child in hours if the wind turned against you. Outside, coyotes howled. Inside, he laid down his pride and begged quietly for the ancestors to listen. "I don't care what she is. She's a child. She's brave. She saved me. If there's any balance left in this world, give it to her." He held her through the coldest part of the night, wrapped in one blanket, the fire dying low beside them. Her breath fluttered like a candle fighting wind, and then, without warning, she stirred. Her eyes opened, hazy but focused. "Takakota," she whispered. He sat up, afraid to speak, afraid she'd vanish like a ghost. She blinked slowly. "I saw Mama," she said. "She was standing in the water. She told me to come, but I said no. I told her it wasn't my time." He exhaled for the first time in hours. "You came back," he said softly. Rosa nodded weakly. "You sang." "I heard you." "You scared the hell out of me," he said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Her hand found his. "I knew you'd be there." That night she slept without fever, her small frame curled against him like a pup against warmth. He sat up beside her, feeding the fire slowly, his back to the cave wall. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Not chasing something, not running. Just here. He looked up at the stars breaking through the cloud cover, spread wide across the Texas sky like silver seeds thrown by an ancient hand. His chest ached in a strange way, not pain exactly, but weight, the kind that comes when something lost begins to return. He wasn't a scout anymore, not a warrior, not even part of the people who'd once called him kin. But holding Rosa in his arms, he felt a kind of peace he'd never found in blood or land. He was doing something that mattered. She'd fought to live because someone had stayed, because someone had believed her life was worth the fight. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the kind of man his grandmother had hoped he'd be. The wind outside shifted, carrying the faint smell of horses. Takakota froze. He rose, stepped just beyond the mouth of the cave, crouched low against the stone. There were tracks in the dirt that hadn't been there before, fresh ones. Rosa had survived the fever, but someone else was now on their trail, and judging by the hoofprints, they weren't riding alone. The trading post came into view just after midday, its sun-bleached walls tucked beneath a cluster of cottonwoods along a lazy bend in the river. The building leaned like it had been built in a hurry and never properly finished, but smoke rose from its chimney, and the smell of fresh beans and lard drifted through the air. Takakota tightened his grip on Rosa's hand. She had recovered, but not completely. Her steps were smaller, breath shallower, but her eyes had sharpened, alert in ways no child should ever have to be. She didn't complain. She hadn't since the cave. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Inside, the air was warm and thick with dust, dried herbs, and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. Shelves lined with canned goods, tools, old books, bolts of faded fabric. A wooden counter stretched across the back wall, behind which stood a man in his 60s with a tobacco-stained mustache and a kind smile. "Buenos dias," he greeted in Spanish, before switching to English. "Travelers?" Takakota nodded once. "Looking for supplies." The man's wife appeared from behind a curtain, her gray hair braided tight, an apron tied around her waist. She looked at Rosa first, eyes softening. "She looks hungry," the woman said. We're not beggars, Takakota replied, but Rosa stepped forward. I can help stock shelves. Or sweep. I'm quick. The woman's expression didn't change. You're a guest, and guests eat before they work. Takakota hesitated, then gave a slight nod. The couple introduced themselves as Enrique and Marta Esperanza. They'd run the post for nearly 20 years, serving travelers, ranchers, and outlaws alike, so long as they didn't bring trouble through the front door. Rosa ate a bowl of beans and rice like it was a feast, and then, when Marta returned with a worn, leather-bound book, something shifted. You know your letters? Marta asked, placing it on the table beside her. Rosa shook her head. Not all of them. Then you'll learn. My mother taught me with this book. It still works. The book was tattered and smelled like oil and sage. The first page had drawings of animals and their names printed in uneven block letters. Rosa traced each one with her finger, lips moving in silence as she tried to sound out the words. Takakota watched from the far end of the room, sitting with Enrique, sipping bitter coffee. She yours? Enrique asked quietly. Takakota paused, then said, In the ways that count. Good, Enrique replied. She'll need someone. You both will. Later, while Marta and Rosa sat outside under the shade of a porch awning, Rosa looked up from the book. I remember something, she said suddenly. From the cantina. Before I warned Takakota, Marta looked up from her stitching. What is it, Nina? There was a man. Not the one with the poison. Another. He wore a ring with a black stone. He always came late after dark and brought papers. They talked about places, names, how many Apache would be there, and they paid him. You heard names? Marta asked gently. Vasquez, Rosa said slowly. Antonio Vasquez. He laughed about it once, said, The army pays better than the railroad. Marta's fingers froze over the thread. Then she stood. Wait here. She went inside. A few minutes later, Enrique came out, jaw clenched. I know that name, he said to Takakota. Antonio Vasquez. Used to run with the cartels down south. Slippery, smart. Knew how to get close to the army without being part of it. What's he do now? Businessman, Enrique said bitterly. Owns half the freight lines through West Texas. Stores, banks. Built himself clean. But he didn't get rich on horses and sugar. He sold positions, sold movements, told the bluecoats where the winter camps were. Takakota's stomach dropped. You saying he betrayed the Apache? I'm saying he's the reason why whole bands disappeared without a shot fired. The soldiers showed up before they even moved their tents. And the bounty on me? Enrique nodded. Could be tied. Especially if he thinks you're someone who saw too much. Rosa had come to stand beside them now, her face pale but steady. I heard more, she said. Not everything, but enough. Dates, town names. I didn't understand all of it, but I remember Enrique looked at her with something approaching awe. You've got something powerful, child. A memory sharper than a knife, Marta stepped outside, holding a small notebook. If she remembers, she should write it down. Every detail, Rosa looked to Takakota. Should I? He met her gaze. Only if you're ready. She took the notebook. I want him to pay, she said, for what he did. To your people. To mine he didn't correct her. Because she wasn't wrong. That night, under lamplight in the spare room Enrique and Marta had offered them, Rosa sat at the desk and began to write. At first, her letters were crooked, clumsy, then steadier. Word by word, she spilled the things she'd kept inside, whispers she'd overheard while sweeping floors, names spoken over drinks, money counted behind closed doors. Takakota stood by the window, listening to the scrape of pencil on paper. They didn't know yet what they would do with it. But for the first time since they'd fled Paso Blanco, they had direction. a name, a target, and Rosa, once a silent shadow, now held the most dangerous weapon in the territory: the truth. The next morning, just before dawn, a rider arrived at the trading post, dusty, nervous, sweating through his collar. He didn't notice the girl peeking through the window or the man watching from the shadows of the barn, but he did carry a sealed letter addressed to Antonio Vasquez, and he did mention, too loudly, that the Apache was alive and traveling with a white child. Someone inside Vasquez's circle now knew exactly where to find them. The village sat in the crook of the Brazos River, where the waters moved slow and wide beneath cottonwood trees that whispered like old women gossiping. The place wasn't much to look at: 2 rows of cabins, a schoolhouse with a leaning bell tower, and a church that hadn't seen a preacher in years. But it breathed like a place still trying to be good. That was enough for Takakota. They arrived dusty, sunburnt, and silent. But silence didn't bother the people of Brazos Crossing. They were used to folks arriving with more past than future. The village elder, a tall woman named Lupe Serrano, with hands like bark and a voice that didn't shake for anyone, greeted them with one glance and a nod. "We don't ask questions we don't need answers to," she said, and showed them to the old widow's cabin that had been sitting empty since spring. It smelled like thyme and cedar. Rosa opened the shutters, light spilled in, and for the first time since Paso Blanco, she smiled without hesitation. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of the village, near the river bend. That's where they met Franciscoca Alvarez. She was in her 50s, with silver hair wrapped in a loose bun and eyes sharp enough to slice through lies. She taught children of ranchers and field hands in Spanish and English, with a ruler that had left more than one boy with a bruised knuckle. When Rosa stepped into the school, holding her worn notebook to her chest like a shield, Franciscoca took one long look at her and nodded. "This one's got fire." "She reads," Takakota said. "Wants to write more. She'll learn. But fire can be dangerous if no one teaches it where to burn." And so Rosa became her student. She sat at the front beside a window that overlooked the river, and every day, after lessons in arithmetic and geography, Franciscoca handed her a fresh page and said, "Now tell me what you remember." At first, the memories came in fragments: half names, times of day, the sound of coins dropping into sacks. Then more: locations, dates, the way Vasquez had laughed when someone mentioned a raid that hadn't made the papers. Rosa began to recall not just words but expressions, body language, who looked away, who leaned in. She wrote in slow, careful script, looping letters like roots, trying to anchor truth into the page. Franciscoca corrected her grammar, helped her label each entry, and organized the pages into a ledger. "You're not just writing a story," Franciscoca told her one day. "You're building a case." Meanwhile, Takakota didn't rest either. He hunted the hills for fresh meat, tanned hides, and brought herbs to the midwives. When a boy broke his arm falling from a tree, Takakota set it clean with a stick, a prayer, and a poultice. Word spread quickly that he was no savage, no threat, but someone who knew how to help. The people of Brazos Crossing were too poor to be proud and too tired to turn away kindness. One afternoon, after bringing Rosa home from the schoolhouse, Takakota found a man waiting on their porch, a tall figure in a dark suit, boots scuffed, hat in hand. "Name's Judge Lionel Crocker," the man said, tipping his brim. "Franciscoca told me I ought to come by and hear what the girls got to say." They sat at the kitchen table, Rosa's notebook open between them, the sun crawling in through the shutters like a slow cat. Rosa read aloud. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she went on. Crocker didn't interrupt, just stared at her with the quiet intensity of a man used to listening for lies. By the time she finished the third entry, the room was silent. You saying this girl remembered all this from sweeping floors? He asked, looking at Takakota. She doesn't forget things, he said, especially not the ones that matter. Crocker ran a hand through his beard. I know the name Vasquez. Never been able to catch him with anything solid. Always someone else holding the bag. Well, Franciscoca said from the doorway, maybe it's time someone held him accountable. Judge Crocker stood slowly, slid the notebook into a leather satchel, and buckled it closed. I'll need to verify some of this, he said. But if even half of what she's written holds up, there'll be blood in the water. Takakota stood too. You said he's untouchable. Crocker nodded. He is. Until someone decides to reach that night, Rosa didn't sleep right away. She sat on the porch steps, her knees tucked under her chin, watching the fireflies drift across the tall grass like floating stars. Takakota joined her in silence. You think they'll believe me? She asked. They already do. No, I mean, believe enough to act. He looked at her, saw the weight she carried more than a child should, more than most men did. You gave them truth, he said. That's all anyone can give. What they do with it is on them. She leaned her head against his arm. I don't want to be brave every day. You don't have to. Just today the moon hung low and full, reflecting in the river like a second world waiting beneath the surface. But miles away, in a whitewashed house with guards on the porch and ledgers full of blood money, Antonio Vasquez sat in a leather chair, sipping brandy, unaware that a girl with a quiet voice and a ledger full of memories had just placed a crack in the foundation of his empire. And it was starting to spread. The wagon creaked into Paso Blanco just after sunrise, wheels grinding against the dust-packed earth. Takakota held the reins with a quiet steadiness, but his jaw was clenched. Rosa sat beside him, her shoulders back, face unreadable. She wore a clean blue dress Franciscoca had mended the week before. Her notebook, well-worn, dog-eared, and full of truth, rested in her lap. Ahead, the town looked just as it had the day they fled it. The cantina still leaning to one side, the church bell hanging crooked in its frame, the streets half asleep. But the silence was different this time, watchful, expectant. They weren't alone. Judge Crocker had arrived the day before, armed with warrants and a territorial marshal. Word had spread fast. Someone was finally standing up to Antonio Vasquez. And the witness wasn't a lawman or politician. It was a girl. The town square had been swept clean for the occasion. A wooden platform stood near the fountain, benches filled with locals, ranchers, and merchants. Some had traveled miles to be there. Most had come not out of duty, but curiosity. They didn't know what to expect from a child, especially one that looked so small beneath the wide sky. Takakota helped Rosa down from the wagon. You ready? He asked. She looked up at him, eyes steady. I've been ready since the day he tried to kill you. They walked side by side toward the platform. Vasquez was already there, seated behind a polished table under the watchful eye of the marshal. He wore a cream-colored coat, his mustache neatly trimmed. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. When he spotted Rosa, his lips curled. You again, he muttered. Judge Crocker rapped the gavel once, the sound cracking through the morning air like a gunshot. This isn't a formal trial, he said. Not yet. But it is a public hearing, a place for truth to be spoken aloud. He nodded toward Rosa. You may proceed. She stepped forward. Silence fell across the square. I'm Rosa Herrera, she said, 12 years old. I used to live in the back room of the cantina here. I cleaned floors. Wasn't paid. Wasn't fed unless I begged. But I listened. And I remembered. She opened the notebook, the pages fluttering in the breeze. She cleared her throat. On March 14th, Antonio Vasquez met with a man named Cooper. They talked about Apache settlements near Red Bluff. Vasquez sold the location, said the soldiers would move in by end of week. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. On April 2nd, Vasquez took payment for information about land deeds. Families who refused to sell, Mexican families mostly, were marked for removal. One of them was named Herrera. My parents, that was the first time her voice cracked. But she didn't stop. She kept reading, date by date, name by name, numbers, locations, bribes. Some people looked away, others leaned in closer. By the time she closed the notebook, there was no sound at all. Vasquez stood. "This is madness," he said. "You're taking the word of a child? An uneducated runaway girl with a grudge?" "Maybe I am," Judge Crocker replied, "but I'm also taking the word of Mr. Esperanza, who confirmed payment receipts, and of Miss Alvarez, who validated the ledger, and of 3 other witnesses who came forward after hearing about this hearing." He looked around the crowd. "Would anyone else like to speak?" There was a pause. Then a man rose near the back, middle-aged, worn boots, hat in hand. "I saw Vasquez threaten Don Benito over his land. Told him if he didn't sign, soldiers would find a reason to visit." 2 days later, Benito's barn burned to the ground. A woman stood next, then another. Each story came like waves breaking against stone. Judge Crocker listened, nodding slowly. Then he looked to the marshal. "Take Mr. Vasquez into custody." There was shouting then. Vasquez protested, struggled, but it was too late. As the chains closed around his wrists, Rosa didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She just watched, like someone finally waking from a long nightmare. The sun rose higher, cutting across the plaza, and the people who'd come out of curiosity now stood in solemn respect. Later, after the crowd began to thin, Crocker approached Rosa. "You didn't just speak," he said. "You gave the people permission to speak too. That's rare." She nodded quietly. "I didn't do it alone." He turned to Takakota, who stood a few feet back, arms crossed. "You raised her well." Takakota didn't answer, just nodded. The townspeople gathered around Rosa then. Some clapped her on the shoulder. Others whispered thank you. A few simply stared like they were seeing her for the first time. They asked her name. She told them. They asked where she was from. She said, "Here and not here." And when they asked what came next, she looked at the sky and said, "Justice." I hope that night, back in the cabin in Brazos Crossing, Rosa sat at the table with the notebook in front of her. Takakota placed a steaming cup of tea beside her and said nothing. "I thought I'd feel different," she said. "You are different," he replied. "You just don't see it yet." She looked out the window where the wind was picking up across the field. "It's not over," she said. "He may be in chains, but his money, his people, they're still out there." Takakota met her eyes. "Then we stay ready." She nodded once, because Rosa knew something now. She wasn't just the girl who shouted in the cantina. She was the voice that cracked open silence, and someone was going to want to shut that voice down for good. The soil was rich, darker than Rosa remembered. When the spring rains came, it turned soft beneath her boots, giving easily underfoot like something willing to forgive. The old land, her family's land, had waited for her without resentment, and now it would serve a new purpose. Not as a farm, as a school. The idea had come quietly, not in a dream or a declaration, but in the steady rhythm of children's voices along the Brazos. Kids with skin all shades of dirt and sun, speaking English and Spanish and Apache, all tripping over the same vowels, all asking the same questions. The kind of children no other place had made room for. That's when she knew. She'd build a place that did. The farmhouse still stood, though its roof sagged and the walls bore the scars of time and silence. But the bones were strong, adobe and heartwood, and Rosa believed in bones. She and Takakota worked from sunup to sundown, fixing what could be fixed, clearing what couldn't. Neighbors pitched in, some out of guilt, some out of hope. No one was turned away. Franciscoca Alvarez came first. "You're gonna need someone who can run the place," she said, stepping onto the porch with a worn satchel full of chalk and ledgers. Rosa smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Franciscoca nodded once. "And you're gonna need discipline. These kids don't come from soft places." "I didn't either," Rosa said, and they didn't speak about it further. Takakota took the small barn and turned it into a workshop. He taught the boys and girls to hunt, trap, identify plants that could heal and those that could harm. He was quieter than the other instructors, but none of the children missed a single lesson. There was something in the way he moved, calm and deliberate, that made even the most restless among them sit straighter. When one boy asked if he'd ever killed a man, Takakota looked at the trees for a long time before saying, "Only when there was no other way." The boy never asked again. Rosa taught reading and writing in a room with wide windows and slanted light. But she didn't stop there. She taught them how to listen, really listen, and how to ask questions that made adults shift in their chairs. She taught them how to write letters to mayors and judges, how to document injustices, how to make a record when no one else would. One day, a girl named Clarita asked, "Why do we have to learn all this?" Rosa looked at her, steady. "So you know when someone's lying to you. And so you have the tools to stop it." At the front of every classroom, etched into the wooden beam, was the school's only official rule. No child here is less than. They called it the Crossing School. No last name, no saints or generals, just a word that meant movement, convergence, something in between. A place where things met and changed. One afternoon, Rosa found Takakota out by the garden, helping a boy set a line of stakes for beans. The boy was quiet, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. "War injury," someone had whispered. He was 10. Takakota wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at Rosa. "You made this place," he said. "We did." He shook his head. "No. This was yours before it was anything she looked out over the grounds. Children chased each other between the trees. A group sat beneath the porch, reading aloud in 3 languages. The garden was taking root. My mother always said words could be weapons," she said. "They are," he replied, "and you use them well." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she whispered, "You think she'd be proud?" He turned to her fully, eyes soft. "She'd be proud you survived, but even more proud that you gave survival a purpose." At dusk, they gathered by the fire pit at the center of the school grounds. It had been Rosa's idea, one communal place to end the day, one place where stories could be told and remembered. That night, one of the older students, a half-Apache boy named Joseph, stood and read a letter aloud. It was addressed to the territorial governor. A petition. It asked for protection for the school's mixed-race students and for funding to expand the library. When he finished, the others clapped, not out of habit, but from something deeper recognition. Rosa looked at the fire, then at Takakota. "This is what we needed when we were young," she said, "and it's what they need now." She felt the wind shift cooler, heavier. Autumn was coming. So was the next fight. Word had come that Vasquez's lawyers were petitioning the capital, that some of the land he'd lost in court was being claimed by others, with ties to money and influence, that some weren't too happy a 12-year-old girl had helped bring down one of the most powerful men in the region. She'd known it wasn't over. But what she hadn't expected was the letter that arrived the next morning, carried by a government courier with a nervous look in his eye and sweat staining the armpits of his shirt. The letter was sealed with the emblem of the Federal Justice Department, and it had her name on it. Only hers, not Takakota's. Inside, it said the investigation into her parents' deaths had been reopened, and they no longer believed it was fever that killed them. The letter came folded in a thick envelope, delivered by a rider in a navy coat who refused a drink of water and rode off before his boots could cool on the porch. Rosa turned it over in her hands, already knowing it held more than just words. It held the past. She opened it alone. Takakota waited outside the schoolhouse, knowing better than to hover. Inside, the children laughed and hollered through reading lessons with Franciscoca. Life continued, but in Rosa's chest something paused. The letter was from the Department of the Interior. The seal was real. The ink was fresh. The first paragraph expressed sympathy. The second, suspicion. And the third confirmed what she had feared but never dared say aloud. Her parents hadn't died from fever. They had been poisoned. The water in their well had been deliberately tainted. The motive, according to an anonymous informant, was their refusal to sell their land to a man now known far and wide for deeds worse than greed. Vasquez. Rosa sat still as stone. The only sound was her own breathing, shallow and sharp. Her father's face came back to her, creased and kind, always smelling of cedar and ash. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, reading aloud by lantern light. Takakota stepped through the door but said nothing. His silence was solid, a shelter. "They were murdered," Rosa whispered. Her voice didn't shake. "They tried to take the land, and when that didn't work, they took their lives." He nodded once. No questions. He believed her before the letter ever said it. "I need to go back," she said, looking up at him. "To the farm." "To the house. Then we'll go," he answered. The journey felt different this time, less like travel, more like returning to a battlefield. The trees seemed taller, older. The air held the scent of wild sage and river mud. When they reached the land, the gate still bore the scorched mark of Vasquez's men from years ago, though time had weathered the burn into something less cruel. Inside the house, dust blanketed everything like snow left too long. The rooms were smaller than she remembered, but the memories loomed large. She walked the floor slowly, trailing her fingers over cracked beams, scorched corners, and the stone hearth her father built by hand. Then, in the corner of her old bedroom, she noticed a floorboard that sat slightly higher than the rest. She knelt, pried it open, and found it, a cloth-wrapped bundle tucked in the hollow beneath the boards. Inside was a small journal leather-bound, faded at the spine, pages filled with looping script she would have known anywhere, her mother's handwriting. Rosa sat cross-legged on the floor, Takakota nearby but silent. She flipped through the pages, each one a fragment of her mother's mind, recipes, planting schedules, observations of the stars. Then she reached the final page. The ink was lighter, the words rushed, but still graceful. "I teach her to read early. I feel one day she will need words to survive." Rosa stared at the sentence, lips parted, breath caught in her throat. The paper blurred with tears she couldn't hold back. "She was right," she said, her voice breaking as she clutched the journal to her chest. Takakota placed a hand on her shoulder, not to comfort, but to anchor. "She gave you more than life," he said. "She gave you the way forward." They buried the journal beneath the sycamore tree out front, where Rosa used to climb and look out over the valley. It felt like placing a cornerstone, not an ending. As they prepared to leave, Rosa turned to look at the house one last time. It didn't look ruined anymore. It looked reclaimed. "I'm going to finish what they started," she said. "Not just here, but beyond." For everyone they tried to silence, Takakota gave a slight nod. "Then we'll need allies." And they got them. By week's end, a telegram arrived. Not from Texas, not even from the territories. It came from Washington. A senator wanted to meet the girl who brought down Vasquez. and offer her something she never expected. Not revenge. Power. The old farmhouse still creaked when the wind rolled through, but it no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like children, laughter, learning, life. Rosa had turned the land of her blood and loss into something sacred. Not a shrine, a school. Stone by stone, nail by nail, the old house became a boarding school for children of all kinds. Apache, Mexican, Anglo. Boys who had worked cattle their whole lives, girls who had never held a book, sons of miners, daughters of seamstresses, orphans, dreamers, wanderers. They came from all across the Southwest, packed on stagecoaches, wagons, even on foot with only a bundle of clothes and a burning question in their chest. Was it true? Was there really a place where no one got turned away? Where a name didn't decide your worth? Where a girl once stood in the middle of a town square and used words like bullets? Yes, it was true, and Rosa kept her promise. She taught literacy, yes, but more than that, she taught the power behind it. She taught how to write letters to the governor, how to read land deeds and question the ink, how to tell stories that couldn't be erased. Franciscoca, now with silver threads in her long braid, served as headmistress, running the dorms with grace and thunder. And Takakota, his presence a living link to another world, taught survival, not just in the wild, but in the world. Tracking, planting, history passed down from fireside to firelight. They called the place Esperanza Hollow, Hope's Hollow. Rosa's classroom always had one cracked window, on purpose, so the sound of wind in the cottonwoods could drift in while she read aloud. Years passed, and one spring morning, as students swept the porches and flags flapped over the fields, Rosa stood in front of a small mirror, adjusting her collar with trembling fingers. Today, she would marry. The guests had gathered under the same sycamore where her mother's journal was buried. Flowers had been gathered from the valley, wild and stubborn like the children who grew here. Dr. Michael Rivers, once a quiet, sharp-eyed boy from Durango, now a gentle physician and civic leader, waited at the altar with his heart wide open. And it was Takakota who took her hand. He didn't say much, just squeezed it tight. His face had grown older, lined like the bark of trees he still walked among, but his voice was steady as he whispered, "I told you once, your mama taught you to use words like weapons. Now look what you've built," Rosa smiled through tears. "Not alone. You were always there." When they reached the altar, Takakota placed her hand into Michael's, then stepped back. And for just a moment, Rosa looked over her shoulder, not in regret but in reverence for everything it took to arrive at this peace. Years blurred. Rosa became a figure of quiet fame. Invitations arrived from governors, university deans, and civic leagues. Some came to praise, others to probe. She never chased power, but she didn't run from it either. Then one autumn, under golden aspens, Rosa was honored with the regional prize for educational justice. They gave her a medal and a microphone. She thanked the students, the land, and the ones who never got the chance to speak. At the small reception that followed, Takakota stood with her at the edge of the fields, the sun sinking low, painting the sky in burnt orange and rose. "You didn't just save me that day, Rosa," he said. "You built something the world needed." She didn't blink. "We built it." Together behind them, voices rose from the schoolyard, clear, laughing, layered. One child told a story in English. Another translated it in Spanish. A third whispered it again in Apache. And somehow the three languages danced like river currents, flowing into something whole. A harmony the world had forgotten how to sing. As the sky turned indigo and stars blinked awake, Rosa stood still and listened. The sound of hope wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was woven like a thread between words, binding people together. Esperanza Hollow was just one valley, but stories were seeds. and somewhere beyond the mountains and mesas, someone else was already waiting to plant their own. If this story moved your heart, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe to Western Legacy because the West has more to say, and the next voice just might surprise you.